You know, when we think about Geneva around the time of the Reformation, 16th century, Calvin often comes to mind, right? Big debates.
Yeah, the theological shifts, definitely.
But what about like the everyday stuff, the city's institutions? Today we're diving into Geneva's hospitals during that transition. It's pretty fascinating.
It really is, and often overlooked, I think. These places were changing dramatically.
Hmm.
Our main guide here is Christophe Chazalon's work on the hospitals at this turning point.
Right. Les hôpitaux de Genève au tournant de la Réformation.
Exactly. And we'll bring in some context from broader medieval studies, too, like Duparc Herman, just to paint a picture.
Okay, so the mission today is to sort of untangle this history of the hospitals right before and during the early Reformation. It can get a bit confusing.
It definitely can.
So first off, the sheer number of hospitals. I pictured maybe one or two,
Yeah, that's a common thought. But the sources, like Chaponier and Saudet, they suggest maybe two before the mid-1300s.
Okay.
But then, almost boom, three more pop up pretty much simultaneously, which probably points to, population growth, maybe more foreigners coming in.
And it didn't stop there, did it?
No, in the 15th century, another two were founded, thanks to a generous citizen.
Wow. So by 1535, right when things are really heating up with the Reformation?
We're looking at least 9 hospitals under Geneva's control. Some earlier accounts said 7, but Chazalon finds more.
Including a 10th one?
Yes, the Hôpital du Temple, also called Saint-Jean de Jerusalem, it was down in Eaux Vives.
Okay, so way more than you'd initially guess.
Definitely. And another thing to keep in mind, something Chazalon stresses, is the names. They weren't fixed.
Ah, that's bound to cause confusion.
Exactly. A single hospital might have 2, 3, even more names depending on the benefactor or the time period. It makes tracking them tricky.
Right. So let's maybe look at a few key ones before everything got centralized into the Hôpital General.
Good idea. Where should we start? How about the Hôpital de Notre-Dame du Pont-du-Rhône, also called Saint-Gervais,
Okay, where was that one?
en Rue de la Cité? Now, it was linked in name to the Chapelle de Notre-Dame du Pont-du-Rhône.
The chapel.
Right, they weren't attached. Often confused, though.
And the chapel itself has a history?
Oh, yeah. Possibly an old defensive tower, 11th, 13th century, near the bridge. Weird orientation, too, not facing east. Later, wealthy Italians, Florentines, revamped it. Became the Chapelle des Florentins.
But it didn't survive.
No, torn down in 1541. City fortifications needed the space. Records show payments for demolition and all that.
But the hospital itself, it wasn't right there.
No, this is interesting. It was actually about 60 meters upstream from the famous chapel.
Huh. So easy to get wrong.
Very.
Ah.
And after the Reformation, it wasn't needed in the same way, so it was sold off in 1537.
Okay. What about another big one? Maybe the Hôpital de Notre-Dame et Saint-Georges.
Ah, yes, also known as du Bourg de Fort, or de Saint-Joire, or du Bolomier. See the name thing again?
Uh-huh. Yeah, definitely. Where was this one?
Rue Verdun, right next to the St. Clair convent. And this location is key,
Why is that?
because in November 1535, this is the very spot that became the Hôpital General.
Ah, okay. The seat of the central hospital.
Precisely. Its multiple names likely reflect different founders or benefactors, like maybe Mathieu Clarier, Aimons Bourgeois, Guillaume Bolomier. The council even had a say in appointing the hospitalier, the manager.
And it grew over time.
Yes, there was expansion around it in the mid-15th century, tied into the founding of that St. Clair convent next door. Land donations, purchases.
Okay. Any others we should quickly mention from before the big merge?
Well, there was the Hôpital de Saint-Bernard de Montjoux, or Saint-Nicolas, on Rue Saint-Antoine. Its story pre-Reformation is fairly short, sold in 1536 to a Pierre Tito who built a house there.
Got it. What about the Hôpital de l'Eucharistie? That one sounds intriguing. Lots of names, too.
Yes, also called de François de Versonnet de la Fête Dieu, des pauvres honteux or vergogneux, even Saint-Esprit sometimes, near the Rive convent.
And it had a specific purpose.
It did. Founded in 1434 by François de Versonnet, specifically for the pauvres honteux.
The shameful poor.
Exactly. People from, privileged backgrounds who'd fallen on hard times and were ashamed to beg. Managed by a merchant confraternity.
That shows quite a nuanced approach to poverty, even back then.
It really does. After the Reformation, the name shifted more towards pauvres vergogneux, but the concept remained for a while.
So this idea of consolidating hospitals, it wasn't totally new in 1535.
No, there were earlier attempts, apparently in 1508 and 1531, but they failed. It took the momentum of the Reformation, really.
For the Grand Conseil to finally decide, okay, we need just two main ones.
Right, the General Hospital, using the St. Clair convent buildings.
Which was right next to the old Hôpital de Notre-Dame et Saint-Georges we mentioned.
Exactly. And then the plan was to keep Saint-Jacques for the passing poor travelers.
So what happened to the femmes vergoneuses from the Hôpital de Eucharistie? Did they move straight to the General Hospital?
Well, that was the plan in 1536. But it seems they didn't move immediately.
Oh.
Records show they were still in their original hospital until at least January 1540. The transition wasn't always instant.
So gradual changes.
Yeah. Eventually, their hospital was sold in June 1541, and the remaining women were moved then.
And what about the Hôpital de Saint-Antoine et Saint-Sébastien near La Madeleine, also founded by Versailles?
That one, too, seems to have had a gradual phase-out. There's evidence of repairs happening in 1539, 1540.
So still in use after the main decision?
Apparently. And people were even renting rooms there between 1539 and 1542. So not a sudden closure, more of a winding down.
It paints a complex picture, doesn't it? All these different places, different purposes, slowly being brought together.
Absolutely. It shows the existing social fabric before the Reformation reshaped it.
So late 1535, the big decision. Create the Hôpital Général. Consolidate.
Yes. And as we said, Saint-Jacques-du-Pont-du-Rhône was initially earmarked for travelers, though another hospital seems to have played that role too, at least for a time.
Which one was that?
The Hôpital de la Trinité, which got renamed Hôpital du Saint-Esprit after the Reformation.
Okay, tell me about that one.
Founded around the mid-15th century, likely by the Confrérie de la Sainte Trinité. Though there's a mention of an earlier donation back in 1360.
And after the Reformation.
And renamed Saint-Esprit. And it definitely continued to function. We see records of people being housed there at the city's expense, like a Jacques Chapuis.
So maybe it took over that role for passing poor instead of Saint-Jacques.
It seems possible, or at least shared it. They even leased out its chapel for a while, before deciding in 1550 to renovate the chapel specifically to house passing poor.
But it didn't last forever.
No, it was sold off just 2 years later, in 1552.
Why sell it if they'd just renovated part of it?
Well, Chaiselon floats the idea that maybe the city needed the money, or perhaps the Hôpital Général needed more space itself for the growing number of poor. This is also the period after Calvin's influence on poor relief really solidifies.
Ah, interesting link. So political and religious shifts influencing property decisions.
Plausibly, yes.
And Saint-Jacques-du-Pont-du-Rhône, the one originally planned for travelers, what happened there?
That one had been around since 1359, near the old bridge gate. But despite the initial plan,
It got repurposed.
completely. By 1543, it had become the Geneva Mint.
The mint. Okay, that's a definite change of function.
Shows the city adapting its assets, doesn't it?
It does. We should probably also mention the boîte de toutes hommes.
Ah, the alms box, yes. Crucial.
This is the main channel for public charity, wasn't it? Collections in churches, etc.
Exactly. Throughout the city and nearby areas. And importantly, after the Reformation, the properties and funds associated with this box likely got folded into supporting the new Hôpital Général.
So, a key source of funding for the centralized system.
Very likely.
Right.
And Hôpital Général also took immediate responsibility for orphans and some illegitimate children. Centralization in action.
Okay, one more major institution. The Plague Hospital. Hôpital de Notre-Dame de la Miséricorde.
Or Hôpital de Pestiférés. A grim necessity. This one was relatively newer, late 15th century.
Founded after a vow.
Yes, the syndics, the city magistrates, vowed in 1469, during an outbreak, to build one out in Plainpalais.
Was it always open?
No, only activated when the plague hit. But after the Reformation, strict rules came in, like mandatory burials in its cemetery during outbreaks.
Must have been incredibly difficult to run.
Unimaginably. Staffing was a nightmare. Records show immense difficulty keeping hospitaliers, barbers who acted as surgeons, and even ministers.
Ministers were reluctant.
Oh, yes. There's a famous dramatic episode where ministers basically refused to go, citing various reasons. Even Sebastian Castellio was considered, but didn't end up going.
Wow.
They eventually ordained a minister specifically for the plague hospital, Pierre Blanchet, but he caught the plague almost immediately and died.
Just horrific. Shows the sheer terror the plague inspired.
Absolutely. They had ordinances for running the place based on older models, but managing it during an outbreak was just chaos and survival.
A stark reminder of the realities of the time.
Definitely puts things in perspective.
Briefly, there were others too, right? Like the Temple Hospital.
Yes, the Hôpital du Temple, or Saint Jean's of Jerusalem in Eau Vive. Origins with the Knights Templar, than the Hospitallers.
Did it function as a hospital right up to the Reformation?
Probably not really. By the 15th century, it seems it was more of a religious and administrative center for their lands. Its church outside the walls was destroyed in 1534 during political tensions.
And after the Reformation?
Disputes between Geneva and Bern over its properties and tithes. It wasn't really an active hospital then.
And there was one in Marlios, Saint-Jacques-les-Majeurs et Saint-Antoine-l'Ermite.
Right. Some thought its fate was unknown after 1539, but Chazlon shows the Geneva Council was still involved, ordering inspections in the 1540s. Its chapel fell into ruin later, but has actually been restored.
Okay. And finally, the Maladiers, leprosy hospitals.
Yes, older institutions. Carouge and Cheyne. Lepers had strict rules, confinement. After the Reformation, responsibility was split. Geneva managed Carouge, Bern managed Cheyne.
Were they full?
Often kept closed, actually, to save money, as there weren't many lepers. There were disputes about admitting new ones in the late 1530s, early 1540s. Shows the practical difficulties.
Right. So, wrapping this up, it's clear the Reformation wasn't just about theology in Geneva. It profoundly reshaped the city's social welfare system.
Absolutely. You go from this diverse, sometimes confusing landscape of many small, specialized institutions,
Each with its own story, its own founders.
to a much more centralized approach, focus on the hopeful general.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't always a clean, sudden break.
No, we saw that gradual change, the continued use of some older places for a time.
And behind all these institutional shifts are, human stories. The people who founded these places, the pauvres en tout, the plague victims, the staff struggling in horrific conditions.
It really makes you think about how those big religious and political changes directly impacted the most vulnerable people on the ground, how care was actually delivered.
Yeah, what does this shift tell us about the priorities of the time, the values?
Maybe a final thought for our listeners. How might the consolidation under the Hospital General, perhaps influenced by figures like Calvin, have changed the experience of being poor or sick in Geneva? Was it better, worse, just different? Something to ponder?
Definitely. Comparing it to how other cities handled similar changes during the Reformation could be revealing too.